All right, please welcome first Affirmative.
Am I good to go? Great. The current state of the tech world currently is that we have had a stifling of innovation, and that is mainly because of the monopolization of consolidation of the tech sector. So proud to affirm. Two arguments in this speech, but before that, a couple of points of setup. The first thing to note here is what do we mean by dominant? And that to say is that you have a significant proportion of the market share and the users in a particular market. That is to say, for example, Zoom has 70% of the market share in online video conferencing. The second thing to note here is about what open sourcing looks like. So that is when you exactly show the code and the intricacies of the particular tech development to individuals. This would allow two things. One, it enables individuals to enable and replicate this code, but also it allows individuals to add on using this code for certain aspects of things, and also making it more efficient. The second thing to consider here is also things like explaining the code. So for example, if an individual has an inquiry about something, explaining the code to that individual and exactly what you are doing. The third thing to note here is on add-ons, and more specifically on their side of the house, add-ons aren't so great. And that is because the current mechanisms of add-ons on NEC is to say that you have to use their technology to use those add-ons. So Chrome add-ons, for example, have to use Chrome extension programs, which means, panel, that you're restricted and the freedom you have is rather null. And oftentimes they often ban you from replicating it altogether. But the last thing I want to frame here is who is likely to access these things, and it's two individuals. One is individuals who are looking to develop a entirely new system. For example, DeepSeek, which is developed from OpenAI. But also it looks at smaller add-ons, things like GIMP, which are used by academics and graphic designers to add small add-ons to specific projects they have. With that being said, first argument then on why we get more diverse products. The first thing to note here is that there's a very big and large thriving open sourcing community, and they are able to add on specific things using this code. For example, Python is now currently open source, and this has allowed individuals to replicate it in a way that makes it more accessible to individuals. For example, accessible to things like using German language for it to be more accessible to German coders. That is the kind of open sourcing that we're talking about. First push in this argument then is on why are people unlikely to get any kind of add-ons and innovation on their side of the house. Crucially then, we'd like to notice that oftentimes when you're dealing with specific communities, it's oftentimes not an incentive for these large tech companies to cater to them, oftentimes because these specific communities are oftentimes extremely niche. So for example, specific academics use this for like astro or like looking at the stars or looking at the specific poster designing. It's often very niche, so the profit and margin you can get is marginal. The second thing to note here is that to cater to these small communities, you require a significant amount of research on these communities, and that is increased cost for corporations. The third thing to note here is that oftentimes when developments of these things, they require significant amount of scale. So oftentimes you look at things that look to impact everyone, so it's optimizing things to make it 0.11% faster, which affects everyone. The last thing to note here is that oftentimes when big companies do things, it's often there's some monetary benefits. So for example, there's a cost barrier for you to access things like Photoshop. There's a cost barrier for you to access things like add-ons. All this proves to you, panel, is that there are significant barriers that exist today that prevents individuals from developing products that are specifically able to cater to their needs. Why do we think there's likely to be better on our side of the house? The first thing to note here is that oftentimes when it comes to structuring code, there's a huge initial startup cost because you're starting this code from scratch, which oftentimes requires a lot of software developers and oftentimes requires a lot of time. Oftentimes individuals from niche communities do not have that kind of time on them. So it's unfortunate they're unable to do this in Negative's world. Compared to an outside house, you give them access to this code and they're able to improve on this code. The second thing to note here is that oftentimes these communities are able to replicate these things far better, and they often do this for altruistic reasons as well. Because notice, oftentimes tech developers often is very altruistic in nature, but B, we also think there's a significance of reputation you're able to get as a savior who provides specific product to an individual, and we think that's tremendously great. So therefore, we think we're able to specifically give this code to a specific industry. What are the benefits of this then? Couple of reasons. One, we're able to then satisfy specific niches that exist in society, and we're able to satisfy those requirements. The second thing to note here is on their side of the house, you often just lock out people, because for example, for you to use Google, you often have to buy the entire suite of Google things. So for example, you cannot use Google Calendar alone, it's only compatible with Chrome. Comparatively on our side of the house, we're able to get more cross-applicability, design which is most suited for you. But most often not panel, I think we're able to develop technology that is A, you're able to save money because you're able to now not just completely rely on Google and those companies, but also you're able to cater them to solve specific problems which is catered to you, which I think is far more efficient than using the tremendous amounts of code that could not specifically meet your requirements. Second argument then on monopolies. First thing to note here is that oftentimes when it comes to innovation, monopolies on either side of the house, or tech companies rather, have an incentive to innovate. Why is this? This is because innovation is the main way you can develop revenue, and there's an incentive for you to constantly be profitable and control market share. Therefore, Pham, we think innovation is likely to be symmetric on both sides of the house, because you always have the incentive to revenue generate. Why then is it that currently monopolies, why is it currently that the tech industry is ridiculously consolidated? Couple of reasons why. The first thing to note here is the thing I told you earlier. It is a compatibility problem, in the sense that you cannot use Apple Calendar with Google Chrome, so therefore you're kind of locked into that kind of company. The second thing to note here is oftentimes things like pre-downloads. For example, Google pays Apple a significant amount of money to come as the default browser on iPhones, so therefore you are locked out of using different kinds of browsing purposes. The third thing to note here is also things like worker consolidation. So oftentimes they hire the best of the best in these kinds of companies, and that results in you not actually having more diverse range of products available. And the last thing to note here is also in terms of accessibility, because oftentimes you just easily download the stuff that you're well known, and therefore you're likely to just be consolidated. The second thing to note here is that it's very hard to regulate in status quo. And the reasoning is this, and that is, oftentimes algorithms are just extremely complicated to understand, but B, oftentimes they're locked up behind patents and trade secret protections, so you cannot really understand where this code is. What are the negative effects of monopolization? Couple of reasons why. First, we think there's no incentive for you to innovate. So consider you're consolidated, you have no incentive to innovate and make products better. But secondly, you can use anti-competitive mechanisms to lock out any kind of competition that you can. So this is like dropping your prices comparatively to any other individuals and drowning out any kind of competition you have. But also, it includes things like workers, because now you only have options of working at Google and Facebook, and you don't have any other option, which you think can push you to worker problems as well. But also, it gives an incentive for you to things like price gouge as well, because you rapidly increase the prices on their side of the house. The last thing to note here is that also we're able to, in terms of the algorithm regulation, notice how Facebook's algorithm is used for things like deadly riots in places like Myanmar. Crucially then, if we're able to get access to things like these algorithms, we can better understand where exactly Facebook is going wrong, and therefore able to adjust for those things on our side of the house. So therefore, Pham, I think we're able to best deal with these things. Why are then we able to prevent these monopolies from accessing? Two reasons why. One, you're able to access code. So when you're able to access this code, you're able to develop better products, which allows you to outcompete big competitors, because now you're able to just offer a better product to individuals. But second thing to note here is that considering you have the details to the algorithm, you can then it's easier then for corporations, or governments rather, to regulate these industries, so therefore you can prevent these monopolization from occurring. For all of these reasons, we urge you to affirm.
Awesome. Thank you very much to First Affirmative. I now invite First Negative up to open the case for the negative team. Here.
one piece of clarification and then 3 pieces of substantive. First thing I'm just going to clarify is that I think the code for making a search engine is pretty accessible regardless. But I think what actually changes within the scope of this debate is kind of special creative touches. And this looks like things like, okay, so to clarify this, it's just like Yahoo and Bing obviously exists. Like the search engines for these things, the code is pretty accessible. But the specific algorithm to add creative touches, for example, the new summary AI feature on Google, or like the spider that guides users to navigate the website. These are the kind of innovative creative touches that are being taken. I think this just minimizes a lot of the kind of damage, like the locking out arguments that the opposition makes. Okay, so for 3 pieces of substantive, firstly, why people ought to have rights, principle on why people ought to have rights and maintain control over their work. The first thing that I'm going to explain is that this work is incredibly expensive and time consuming. People have literally worked on this type of code and innovation for decades because they're making new technology that's incredibly complex. It takes a lot of creativity from an individual person's mind. It takes a lot of time to generate this capital. These are people's passion projects. People dedicate their entire lives to making these innovative additions, and therefore, because you have messed their costs, you should be able to kind of control this technology. Others should not be able to profit off of you. I think as a society, we value IP across all other industries, for example, art, pharmaceutical companies, media, etc. But we think this is particularly pernicious for kind of software stuff, because not only can they distribute it, you also give them the source to literally manipulate your own code. I think, this is analogous to stuff like, as an artist, having to hand over drafts of your book, or, having to give the specific family recipes to your competitors, giving the planning process of your movie. This is incredibly intrusive. It takes away a lot of the credit that you are entitled to as someone who has dedicated their entire life to it. This principle is more important when it comes to software IT, because, as I've told you, individuals are much more instrumental in the creation of the work, because their skills contribute so uniquely to the development of this technology. For example, software engineers have unique skill sets, so IT companies will literally pay you an annual contract, even if you're not assigned work, just because they do not want you to go to other companies. This is just to point out the value of these individuals, specific contributions of these individuals to these companies. So, although the corporation does mostly get the profit, because we care about the principle of payment, of credit, of the principle of contribution being so intrinsically unique that we must protect you, we think all practical benefits are nebulous. We're literally willing to cop any kind of we're willing to forego any practical outcome. We are protecting innovators. Coding is often a language. Software is often novel. You ought to care about this way. It's incredibly highly in debate. So, second piece of substantive, why we get worse technology. The first thing that I'm going to explain is why you get less innovation on behalf of companies that own this code. Firstly, because you obviously just get much less profit. But secondly, you just lose a lot of reputation and prestige. When bootstrap things pop up, your work is seen as less impressive. But thirdly, people working for you are less incentivized because they feel more disenfranchised. They feel less valued because there is less excitement and potential for breakthrough. That means that you're less likely to go into these fields in the first place. And also just thinks that I just think it also just looks like a generational shift, a generational devaluing of appreciating technology and development. It looks like people not being excited about new technology, software updates in Apple, etc. This obviously is just really bad for devaluing these individuals. But fourthly, we think that this is a race to the bottom because you would just work less hard on improvements because you know that these will just be co-opted by these other bodies. So no matter what, it will just be instantly snapped away. Therefore, these companies are less likely to invest in kind of improving these softwares. But fifthly, we think that a lot of these companies will just cut costs because there is no long-term profit, because you're not rewarded for innovation that is often just incredibly life-changing. For example, specific tweaks on Google, extra training on AI models, health AI. Companies will just cut costs because they are not being rewarded. They are not being rewarded for their contributions. And it's just much easier than to use this code. But second part of this argument, why there's less innovation from other competing companies. Firstly, because you're less rewarded for doing innovation, because investing capital to innovate is no longer rewarded. Companies just become more complacent. use whatever, use what is the easiest and cheapest. And what they say here is they talk about like niche applications, but obviously like using taking away code goes both ways. So if a smaller developer kind of contributes code, so in this world, in their world, when someone recognizes a very niche need, then Google just takes it and makes it an add-on. Whereas I think on our side, you'll have a small developer that gets more funding and actually gets credit for their effort. Within Google, bigger companies are more incentivized to exploit the works of other individuals because they perceive it as something that goes both ways, and they're scared of this. Last part of this argument, then, why there's less investment from other parties. Firstly, because this kneecaps profit so much, because profit relies a lot on exclusivity, for example, membership tiers and etc. And secondly, there's no long-term profit because not a lot of the time, because there's not a lot of time until other parties just replicate your tech, so you don't do stuff like invest in startups. But thirdly, obviously it just takes risks, so investors are less willing when it doesn't really return too much, when there's a nebulous profit incentive. Often software investors are not exclusive to investing in software. They're more likely to just easily shift away because there is no special incentive. Thirdly, really quickly, why this is just really dangerous technology. I would just refute that this is altruistic, because often this stuff like free book and free music stuff doesn't require source code. It's legit just a whole separate other type of website. What does it actually look like then? It looks like a massive amount of scammers who are very bad faith actors who want to maximize profit and exploit the most vulnerable people who are often not very internet literate. So it looks like moving scamming websites that lead to a lot of viruses. People opt in, scam websites that lead to a lot of viruses, and people often opt to it because of advertising, because people, especially old people, do not know how to navigate it. This means this is really bad because firstly, it just extorts a lot of their money, but secondly, a lot of their security is taken away because it removes their personal information, but thirdly, it reduces public trust in these resources that are often really important to these people's lives, like, calling your family members on Zoom, accessing the internet for research purposes. Second part of this argument, why it's very bad for the environment, because a lot of software you waste so much energy to run, because it costs less, people will just do it less responsibly. This just looks like, billions more tons of water, electricity, carbon being wasted. This is often such a huge part of recent developing technology. This is very, very serious. It literally kills people. It harms the environment in really, really bad ways because people just do not have an incentive to care about it. People just waste, waste resources on a really large scale. So proud to negate.
Thank you very much to the first negative speaker, and I now invite the second affirmative speaker up to continue the case for the affirmative team. Here.
First, on principle, I find it's really funny when our teachers these big companies, big tech companies that already existed for tons of decades or whatever are really passionate in this stuff. Notice how a lot of CEOs change in the next 10 years or something. Notice how basically the majority of the cases, they are monetarily influenced. If they are passionately influenced, I say they are more than welcome to spread this information to the society. Because when you're doing something passionately, you want everyone to know about your stuff, you want everyone to know about your craft. That's the first response on why this is basically untrue. Also, second of all, is the actual passion neglected is on their side of the house. This looks like a lot of people who do have brilliant ideas but cannot do it. 3 reasons for this. 1, their lack of funding. Notice how when a monopoly exists and consolidation of company exists, all the funding are going to this consolidated mass of like companies in general, which means this is a lack of funding on a diversification on a lot of other companies are in that market as well. It looks like when i.e. Chrome is funded like a lot right now, a lot of other influence, a lot of like, let's say Opera and Brave never exist because of how Chrome never open source their Chromium. A lot of funding is going to go straight to over to Chrome instead. Therefore, people who actually want to create a browser for gamer, which is like Opera GX right now, would never have the chance to actually manifest their like passion in their life. So that's already one. So the second of all, they are not likely to get hired if there's no competition. Why is this the case? Basically, because of how, like we already stated to you in a really big extent, a lot of these big companies don't have the incentive to diverge from their old path. So one, chances are that's the way to get the maximum amount of money. They don't want to enable them a lot of add-on. Even if this is the case, they want to get some add-on and they want to get some like more innovation to it. They're gonna be doing that around a paywall. I.e. all the examples that we have, like Zooms, Photoshops, and whatsoever. Photoshop is the one who's having the most add-on right now. You know how much is how much is the cost to do Photoshop? More than it should be. So that's the actual problem right now. It's not a lot of people is actually having incentive to do so, or a lot of people would not have access to do so. Not having people using your service is also a neglect of your passion as well, principally unjust. Third of all, therefore, if we prove competition, we can prove they are more likely to be invested, they are more likely to be hired. Because of how companies right there have an incentive to do innovation whatsoever, they have more incentive to reach out, i.e. when you're seeing like Riot companies, gaming companies, seeing a lot of competitors in the market, they are branching out in media as well, because of how they want to attach a lot of like investment whatsoever. But at the same time, the moment that Riot see that there's no actual money going through the companies, they are firing a lot of artists of their companies because of how they think that they don't need the artists anymore, so that's already good enough for them. That's the instances where you don't manifest all that principle. People are neglected from their investment, neglected from getting hired as well. Therefore, more job and more passion is being fulfilled outside the house. That's already ridiculously better than inside the house. Second of all, some miscellaneous stuff before the important stuff. One, environment. Both of them happen on both sides of the house. There's incentive to invest in like research technology anyway. But also worse on their side. Why? Because on their side of the house, they have to spend more money and more carbon and whatsoever to invest stuff top down, like everything from scratch. On outside of the house, you already got the base. You only need to add it on. There's not that much carbon footprint from just adding it on comparatively to their side of the house where they have to spend tons and tons of money on investment and like researching, which might not even get an actual product in general. And also, so that's already flip again on the environment. Lastly, on scammers. One, if they're internet illiterate, I think both sides of the house, they would just opt into the most reputational stuff. As in, if they don't know much about internet, they would always opt into Google Chrome. They would not opt into some random browsers. This is like basic stuff. But second of all, if we have more legit options outside the house, this is to say that the moment you search a Photoshop app on their side of the house, they're like Photoshop and some scammy stuff, right? On that side of the house, because of how right now there's open sources, more people are doing Photoshop replica to a certain extent, which means that even the search engine and the search results are less of a scam because of that. So how there's more legit option in the market. Again, we flip the analysis by because of how you have no alternative. You want to see, and also the reason why there's so many people getting hacked on their device right now because of Photoshop is because of the amount of money that the paywall is placing right now. People want to search for a hacked version of Photoshop, for a hacked version of YouTube Premium or something. That's the moment when they click into the button. So if we manage to prove first that we already managed to prove why we have more legit options, but if we also manage to prove that we crack down monopolization, we also have, meaning that we are getting the price down whatsoever, people have less incentive to be buying into this kind of narrative as well, which means less scammers actually manifest in this debate. So why is the actual problem in this debate? One, innovation, and two, monopoly. We already deal with our stuff. One, on innovation. Notice how again, even if the second and third speaker trying to say like, oh, there's gonna be a streamlining process because of how you're getting consolidated funding into it, therefore you're gonna get more like progress in the long run. Notice how this is ridiculously untrue. DeepSeek have used a ridiculously less amount of money in OpenAI, ChatGPT, and having a like almost better products in general comparatively. But also, this is to say that one of the most reason for this is simply because of how ChatGPT they are not scared enough because of this reason. They refuse to change with this reason. We have the same version of Zoom since 2020 something in the COVID area. Because of how they know that they don't need to innovate anymore. They still have all the money in the bank because of how they are a really big company, right? They have the chance to do this anyway. It doesn't make sense. They people are still investing in them not only because of their product but also because of their innovation and their their reputation to a certain extent. So therefore, also second of all, if we get better, not fucking say that, but basically that's already proved that that's not a big problem comparatively, even if they brought it up. So what's actually more important on innovation? Again, one, all their innovation analysis is contingent on like basically bad tech is a race to the bottom. One, these kind of companies when they are actual competition right now, they still want to get money anyway. The stockholders want to get money anyway. They want to get share, they want to get the control of the market, so they want to get more market share anyway. So therefore they are still having a lot of incentive to share, right? Second of all, these are big companies. They are not just randomly declare bankrupt or something. They are going to stay in the market for a really long run. At least like a lot of people are forcing them to do so. So they're not just going to be randomly opt out. So therefore they have the incentive to just make more money. So therefore they are going to be pushing for innovation. That's internally already better for these kind of companies because of all the impact I will prove for you in like Nevan's speech as well. So internally these kind of companies have more incentive to innovate. Also second of all, because of the crackdown on monopolization right here, means that there are more competition. I think this is simple enough. More competition means that you're more scared and stockholders are more likely to diverge of their funding as well. So you want to capture your stockholders, you want to capture more investment, you have to do something that people deem as valuable. These companies definitely can do it because of the amount of money, because of the amount of personnel they have in the long run. This is not something that's not feasible for them. So therefore we need a big push for them. And second of all, like I said, innovation means diversification as well. Because of how this is not only about who can get the best new technology, but who can cater for everyone. So the variety of options exists matters for a reason. They can be the most nichest people in the world, but they still deserve to have these kind of services placed for them. I.e., developing countries are still deserve to have the right to use Photoshop. Because of how basically they are still deserve to have a better quality of life. That's good. Lastly, on monopoly, notice how they never rebut anything on that in this debate. The monopoly analysis here simply, they are bad, we good. Well, sorry, they are bad, crack them down. Why is this the case? Why is this a problem? One, OpenAI in the past have some racist AI algorithm in it. Second of all, Facebook has some racist, to a certain extent, influence on like black people within the community. This is impacted by one, the not so transparent algorithm that's being hidden behind the scene. When we're forcing them to be open sources, we are forcing them to do more regulation. It's just basically more transparency, less of this kind of bias stuff. All the other stuff is going to be explained more on Dhruv's speech. I think I already win this debate by myself, but yeah, go on.
Thank you very much to the second affirmative for those final remarks, and I invite the second negative to continue the case of their team. Here.
I think there are two things from side negative that never receive an honest response from affirmative, and I'm keen to see what third affirmative has to say. These are two things. These are first that Esther explains to you that the worst, most pernicious forms of usage of technology can happen under side affirmative because it's incredibly easy to just steal people's code. You don't need to be a smart engineer to do it. This means any random fuck who's a sadist who wants to like create the worst version of Reddit possible or the worst version of 4chan or a forum where pedophiles can meet up can now just like access that, create a secure version of it because they can copy someone else's code. That was an incredibly fucked outcome that they necessarily had to cop under side affirmative. I think the environment is shit in either world is a flippant and insufficient response to that material from Esther. But second, I think they inefficiently ineffectively respond to the principle because they give you 3 responses that don't actually get at the core of it. First, they see this doesn't affect big companies. Obviously, behind a big company, like behind Apple was Steve Jobs sitting in his basement, right, in the 80s, like creating technology, generating something beautiful for the world to use. Behind every big company now was a small guy who had the right to own his own knowledge and his brainchild, right, in whatever form we could preserve it. We did not want it to see it given up. That undermined so much in our society. The second thing they say is that funding undermines this, right? I just don't think it's true that you can't get funding if you're a smart person. Often people want to invest in startup smart ideas. But I also just don't think that that's a practical response to the principle. That doesn't get behind the logic underneath. Third of all, they say, oh, well, people want to be known, so actually we're doing something good for them. But obviously, I think that's worse under their side, right? Because their market share gets diluted and they get less known. But also, there are probably a set of people who still do get funding and who don't want to be known. And this principle obviously still applies to them. We still have 2 things that aren't effectively responded to by side affirmative. 2 other things in this speech. First, on what is best for competition, and second, on what's best for innovation. First, on what's best for competition. Side affirmative, there's 2 claims. First, they say that a significant, the smartest people concentrate in a very small number of firms. That's not true for 3 reasons. First of all, because it's really expensive to hire a Steve Jobs or a Mark Zuckerberg, and you only need a few of those guys, right? Because it only takes one guy sitting in his basement to create a huge, amazing kind of technology. But second of all, I just think it's exceptionally unlikely that these people would all congregate in one firm because your passions probably don't align. Notably, a lot of tech bros have very diversified interests within the realm of technology. But third of all, it's also pretty notorious that these people are egotistical twats who don't want to work with each other. It's the reason why Apple fell out of favor because there were 2 owners and then one kicked off the other, right? They're terrible at working with each other. At the highest level, they can't all congregate in the same firm, and the people in the middle were in abundance because we trained them in universities to be software engineers. That was something that we could probably get under either world. The second claim that I think is more persuasive is that you get monopolies because there's obviously sort of an intuitive competition mechanism, right? But it doesn't work for 3 reasons. First of all, because it's just not true. There's no imperative to get rid of monopolies because they don't really exist. I'm just gonna empirical dump on you here, right? The examples in this debate are Google. Here are some alternatives. Yahoo, Edge, Bing, Firefox, Safari. We talk about Zoom. Here are some other alternatives. Skype, FaceTime, and Microsoft Teams, right? They obviously aren't an absolute monopoly in the market. They still have other competitors. Unclear that their material stands. But even if you think they're monopolies, I think that's okay for 2 reasons. First of all, because I don't think monopolies are actually that bad for four reasons. First of all, because empirically the products are normally just pretty good. Google's great, guys. Second of all, I still think they have the incentive to increase demand even if they have a monopoly on supply, right? Because consumers you want a larger number of people to still demand your product. That still exists. Third of all, I just think there is regulation on deeply unjust practices. They say it's imperfect, but I just don't think that's true. There are lots of independent legislative bodies to regulate really pernicious monopolies. That was just empirically true. But fourth of all, I just think monopolies also operated in economies of scale, which meant they could actually just genuinely be really efficient, which is why a lot of them can actually still thrive. But the other thing to say is that I don't think this is any worse than the comparative that they have to cop, right? Because the comparative is probably stuff like oligopolies, because you cap it at some level at some significant amount of market share. Under that level, probably oligopolistic competition still exists. People can become cartels. They still do anti-competitive behavior. That was probably pretty symmetric. But even if it wasn't, I can give you 2 reasons for why it's actually good to have a monopoly. First of all, because it's actually good when people get some profit. First of all, because you can weather shocks and create more stable supply. And second of all, because you can probably provide higher quality goods. The second reason for why monopoly is actually good is because you just deserve it. The example of Google and Yahoo. Yahoo predates Google, but Google becomes the thing with the greatest market share because they just have the better technology. At that point, monopolies are formed because they are better at their job, which should suggest to you that they are just better. I think that gets rid of their material on why monopolies are some terrible thing. And then the last thing left in this debate is who is better for innovation. I think they have one main claim, which is we do add-ons. Now, from what I can tell from that first speech, there are 2 kinds of add-ons they identify. We tweak existing stuff, like DeepSeek, and then we create new stuff, like Chrome extensions. Here's why. 1, tweaks aren't particularly useful, and 2, additive things happen either way. Okay, first of all, I don't think tweaks are particularly useful for 3 reasons. First of all, empirically, like, guys, shouldn't have used DeepSeek as an example, I'm sorry. Like, it's a literal clone copy of every other kind of AI. It doesn't do anything additive. It's actually just kind of like a bit shittier. But second of all, your time could have been spent better because you could have been doing something actually generative instead of copying someone else's code. Third of all, I don't think these things get used much anyway because there's little product differentiation and people just go with what they already use. They take the path of least resistance. The second set of things then, which are additive things, I just think we can prove we get cooperation under our side because paywalls which should prove to you why paywalls and exclusivity are not a big barrier to entry for people for 4 reasons. First of all, because companies have the incentive to let people use it. Because if people do good stuff on Google, that means that they go to access that through Google. More people access Google on net. That was good for your company. Second of all, people will switch the alternative and you'll become less relevant if you don't let them. Like if Google doesn't let you use their thing, then they just go to Safari and create a Chrome extension on Safari. Then Safari increases in their market share. It's obviously in Google's interest to let them create the Chrome extension on Google. Third of all, you pay people, like you were paid to license stuff, so often people can actually give you stuff in exchange. And this doesn't happen for like tiny little people. This is like government saying we will use your code in order to create really important things. That was just something that was in your incentives. But fourth of all, like empirically sense check this, right? Like lots of people still do make Google Chrome extensions, even if there isn't like open code. All right, I think that gets rid of their material add-ons. They try and give a preemptive response on why innovation is the same on both sides of the house, but I think by their own analysis that's not true. Because they say for the key reason for why we get innovation is revenue. But you cannot have long-term revenue in a market where there is no product differentiation. Because everything is identical, which means consumers can't meaningfully choose one or the other. Firms in the long term can generate no profit. But also, I just think in our world, the most valuable kinds of innovation are lost because you are concentrated in small areas in their world. People take the path of least resistance. Whereas we get large form innovation, which is much more important than their like niche, small parts of innovation. For these reasons, very proud to begin.
All right. Thank you very much, second negative. I now invite third affirmative up to conclude the case of the affirmative team. Here.
Have you heard of a battery saving mode, Dan? When it's red, you can make it not red and it lasts. %, is a really big number. Like it's absolutely huge, and it's exactly how much control that Zoom has. So you can't just list examples of like things that did exist when this debate specifically explains and talks about the dominance that exists. But companies had no incentive to actually help you out because they already controlled all of the market. What was the reason to try and control marginal more portions of that, where you can just keep milking the people that you currently have on the thing that they have? Sorry, that was a shit intro. Firstly, why a set of responses to the points that they try to burden push. And secondly, I'm going to explain why is it that you just get much better products on our side. Finally, breaking up monopolies. The first observation I do want to want to make that I think is really important is that the tech sphere is obviously very different from the relatively conventional monopoly arguments that they make, for the reason that you can go back, right? So say if a company, like, I think their arguments are like, say if a good shoe factory, and then another company takes over that shoe factory, but then if you have good innovation, that like another shoe factory has startup costs that prevent them from entering the sphere. The difference is, if there's a shitty product on their side, you can return to that product because it's very easy for you to do things like publish it to the internet so many people can access it. It's easy for people to edit on that, which means under their side, just because we remove the monopoly that say Google might have, it doesn't mean we get worse products to change, because people take those products and then they improve those products necessarily. Like, you make add-ons which make Google better, right? It's not like you're just replacing them with something that is a cheap knockoff, because this thing would have to explain why those cheap knockoffs are the ones that instead rise to popularity and not just the add-ons under the thing that's already relatively popular that literally enhance the capabilities of the thing on their side. But also, think objectively on the examples. They say DeepSeek is a bad example. It's a brilliant example for the reason that DeepSeek uses about they have 25% of the cores that OpenAI uses. So firstly, on their environment claim, DeepSeek is much better for the environment because they just took their algorithm, made it better and more efficient on our side. But secondly, DeepSeek is maybe a bit bad, which is why it's getting better, because people are able to criticize that and then improve on that. Firstly, why IP more generally doesn't matter. I guess the principle here is like an IP principle more generally. The first thing we would suggest is we infringe on this all the time. Things like restrictions on, for example, when you have things that are open source, like art has to be open source after a specific period of time. Just generally things like pharma companies has to be open source, and that is just because past the point we recognize that people ought to have access because it is healthy for the market and healthy for development. We obviously infringe on this. This is not absolute. Secondly, I feel this extends also, this argument extends to the money, right? Obviously people have the right to money, and that money that is very hard work, they put a lot of effort into, but we obviously tax individuals for the reason that we recognize that it might be helpful in order to redistribute. Or thirdly, as we explained, maybe money was gained in worse ways. Maybe it was through anti-competitive measures, because I want to emphasize 70% is a big number. How do you think this happens? Not just the free marketplace of ideas, it probably is likely through anti-competitive measures that means that it suppresses other groups from entering into, or other companies from exactly accelerating into popularity or things like that. I really want to emphasize this. This is a ridiculously high number. The burden on this team is to explain why this high number is just a natural thing that happens in lots of different industries. This doesn't even happen in the phone industry, right? Think about Apple and Samsung numbers. I think Apple is maybe 50 or 40 or 50%, which is ridiculous, yeah? But the last claim is that I don't think they actually prove that IP itself is moral, and we will take the higher burden and explain why it isn't. And that is just because in order to make any product, you rely on a bunch of public things. You rely on education, you rely on your society in general, you rely on probably open sourcing, by which people use Linux, which is open source, in order to create these technologies. Which means I don't think that people have an absolute right to their products in the sense that it is all of society necessarily enters into them. So obviously you have the right to say profit of those products. It is unclear why you have a right though to specifically the way in which those products are produced, given that you were advantageous by a bunch of other people. But lastly, I just think this is less important, because who are you harming, yeah? The 10,000 Google engineers who are going to have their code put in place now, for example, feel a bit bad because their code is taken away and they can't keep all the money for themselves. They probably get paid a pretty good amount. I hear Google is a pretty good place to work. Compare for the lack of basic resources we explained to you, which leads into the second issue as to why you get better products. That is, even if you assume on their side these people are kind of harmed, or maybe worst case scenario, their salaries are cut from 200k to 100k. Cry me a river, it is just deeply unclear to me why these people matter compared to the ones who are paywalled behind basic services, who cannot, for example, do their work because everything is integrated onto Google and they do not know how to, and they are not able to, for example, use that into their everyday system. I'm sorry, I'm just in academia. It is infuriating how many things and how difficult it is to develop and do your basic work, because there are 20 different companies or with 20 different individual systems, and you kind of unify them under one, because it is how do you put that onto your Outlook email, for example? It is really, really infuriating. Why do we explain we get better services? And there are just a wealth of reasons given at the bottom that are not responded to. I'm not going to say them again, but I think this really emphasizes specifically why having access to this infrastructure and code means that you're able to make add-ons and specifically integrate them past. And the incentives under the status quo is not to innovate them. Because again, the key thing is, if these innovations were bad, presumably then Google would still be the GOAT of all time, and it wouldn't, in fact, it wouldn't actually reduce in popularity on their side. It's not clear why these specifically threaten Google, unless it is specifically that these innovations are, if you assume these innovations are good. Why don't they innovate on their side? The incentive of companies is marginal improvements, because it's easier for you to make your search engine slightly faster, because that's what you've done for the past 10 years, rather than new capabilities. Because communities who want these big developments do not have direct through lines into these companies, or do not have the resources by which to lobby these companies in order to make these big changes. Because there's no reason for you to innovate on their side because you hold so much of the market. What is the reason for you to spend lots of money into new functionality when you gain maybe 0.1? And even if on their side, small companies do innovate, the problem is nobody shifts to those companies because they don't have the advertising of Google. Even if like Skype had this cool new functionality, who in this room is going to test out Skype rather than just default on Zoom, right? It's incredibly unclear as to their side why you get that innovation to any sort of intent. I guess the response to this is like people might do evil things like evil Reddit, you know? Like firstly, it is not clear to me what functionalities here are functionalities that enable you to do specifically evil stuff. But secondly, I guess this applies to like literally everything, you know? Like we probably have like, you know, like any technology, you can have evil iPhones or something, or iPhones presumably let you like post racist things on them a bit more. I think most of the people who are likely to use these things are probably going to be large communities because those are the sets of people who need the knowledge, for example, to like somewhat coalesce. So they're relatively established, would suggest that it's likely to be pretty good people. But secondly, they would have to explain why these like misuses are far greater. When honestly, it's not clear why these guys need like Reddit to do it. Like 4chan exists, you know, it's not clear why. Let's talk about, and I want to unpack this. Yet this is the most significant point here because I think realistically, this team doesn't actually explain why we have a huge like what's it called? A huge like impact on these companies themselves. But I think this is the most salient benefit to a range of people, the most immediate. Let's go quickly as to why like, you know, these the things about, you know, you do not get, like, these companies are likely to die out. Firstly, they say less profit. One, it's Google, primary river. Two, if Google loses money, presumably other companies gain money, so maybe Google might fire engineers. They get hired at the other competitors, which means that on that you have no impact. This also applies to less funding argument, because again, 70% is a big number, which means the incentive for people to make money obviously still exists. But importantly, you don't have a switch that says, oh crap, we're at 30% market share, let's turn off the development button. You obviously can't control it like on their side, which means that, you know, your incentive is just to do as well as you can, as quickly as you can, because you cannot reach that like oligopoly stage that they want, because you cannot control it. The second claim is the race to the bottom. Already respond to that in a range of instances. The third thing is just some qualms about, well, you don't necessarily hire all the best people, sure, but you hire all the really, really good people, and you force them to keep all their IP within your own company, which means that these monopolies are likely to be extended very well. The last thing they say is a series of general reasons why monopolies are good. As we identified previously, things like economies of scale don't really apply in tech, because you're not producing anything, right? Like you just put things on like the internet, right? So you don't need to do that more efficiently. It's just that you develop those things to the same extent like you would alternatively. But secondly, again, we get more scale on our side because it is other people developing for Google and making those add-ons. They improve the products themselves, which means that you're more likely to improve. And the impact of this is immense because these companies just do really suspect stuff, like Facebook manipulating the results of specific elections through voter suppression. And we just can regulate these companies far better and prevent them from the worst harms. All of these reasons propose.
Thank you very much to the third affirmative for those fine remarks. Sorry, just 1 second. Oh, some org stuff. All right. I now invite the third negative up to conclude today the negative case, today's debate, and in fact the in-rounds of Easter 2025.
First, let's talk about the principle, because I think that this team gets away with some really, really cheap responses. But I think that our case and our principle doesn't rely on a lot of the things that they say. Because not only do we prove the value of IP and intellectual property in society, but we actually prove that open source code is uniquely a far more intrusive and immoral form of theft than a lot of the things that they try to equate it to. For example, like we found on book or movie piracy, like we protect investors for their contributions. We even copyright fucking specific colors and grant exclusive use to companies like Tiffany Blue or Cadbury Purple. But this is so much worse. The equivalent of this is like forcing an author or a publisher to release details on drafting and the writing process, forcing animators to release all their innovations and drafts, forcing pharmaceutical companies not only to have an expiry on their copyright, but to literally hand over a list of ingredients to their competitors, or like forcing inventors to release a specific math and formulas behind their innovations. Noting that, we prove to you why inherently in software and uniquely in software, the software engineers are individually forced to share their life's work to be exploited by random hackers on the internet, because individuals, like a lot of software contributions, are credited so much to the creativity and effort and late nights and sleepless days of individual software engineers. I think this is quite unique to any other industry. All their responses don't apply to this extra level of intrinsic intrusion that is open source code. Now I will talk about niche needs getting met and innovation. What they say is like, oh, you get to build on it and make improvements and stuff. I think Isobel responds to this super convincingly. But I also explained that it takes away the interest of these larger companies to do these innovations themselves. I think actually in the status quo, for example, Google is constantly coming up with more stuff, more accessibility measures, niche Easter eggs to improve the user engagement with their brand. Things like Google Scholar is quite new, and it's innovation that they added because they were able to keep that property and use that to differentiate themselves and keep their market share. Now, they cannot keep up with the piracy of their code, and it is actually no longer profitable for them to do these innovations and add-ons, because as Google is quite a large company, any innovations that they do are immediately open source code, right? Which means that you don't have a period of exclusivity for that innovation at all. So, any of your new updates are immediately open and immediately stolen, which is why there is literally no more incentive for Google engineers to think of these new things and think of these new creations and apply their creativity, because immediately as soon as it is published, it is going to be stolen. That is so sad, but it also just means that they literally are not incentivized to do this anymore. They will direct their talents to other things that benefit people less, that utilize their creativity and their unique talents far less. Why is this bad for new innovation then? I think actually they're quite ungenerous on new innovation. In the status quo, a lot of startups and things like that actually aim to tap into these niche markets that large companies miss, and they have unique interests to do this because they know that they start off with a very low market shares. For example, they say, academics that look at the sky, maybe you can create an app for this specific demographic. Maybe you can create a program like Too Good To Go that connects restaurants to charity to minimize food waste. These are all really, really important. And the way that these small startups get investment is because it's profitable to try and take this risk and secure market share in this very niche area. For example, DeepSeek didn't come about because of open source. They needed to find ways to be more environmentally efficient and more cost efficient, because they had to compete with ChatGPT. Like, they obviously wouldn't have found ways to be more cost effective if they could just cut costs by stealing code instead. And I think this logic applies to a lot of other stuff. Like the innovation on efficiency that a lot of new corporations do just would not occur when the very easy cost-cutting mechanism of just stealing someone else's code is very open to you. On their side, I think that you just don't do this new innovation anymore because stealing existing code is so much cheaper and investors prefer it so much more. More importantly, it works both ways. Like, I think that when you have a really important and really awesome niche market that you tap into and have a market share into, your source has to be open as well, right? Which just means it goes both ways. It means it is so easy for large corporations to swoop in and take your code and make it an add-on on Google, take all of your credit and things like that. And that is so much easier because, for example, if I make a niche thing for academics and I have a dominant market share, Google is more famous and has more users and can just steal my code, add it to their platform, take my credit, and kill all of my profits and my life's work. I think large corporations abuse this way more than individuals, as we've explained to you, to no response. And I think that smaller engineers just do not benefit from it as much as they say they do, because large corporations have so much capacity to just take and take and take from all of these small startups that are accruing growing market shares. This is just so bad because small startups are screwed over, but also you just get a chilling effect, a freezing effect, which means you lose incentive to actually try and find these niche markets. Or for example, investors are less interested in taking these risks because they know that you are not going to be protected, and as soon as you grow to a certain extent in this niche market, your code is just going to be taken. They concede when people lose money and profit. For example, they say, Crimea River, if you lose 100K of your income and halve it to 50%, but I also think that therefore it means that they don't respond to our stuff, that when we explain to you, you get so many engineers, unique and creative and really innovative talent, and investors that have massive amounts of wealth, simply just taking their talents elsewhere. Like, I think there are other industries that are profitable that are probably easier to do than innovation. Now that you take away the unique benefits of actually innovating and putting your name to a project and having exclusive credit for that project, you just go to other fields that are probably also profitable protected, I think you have a massive loss of innovation. And I think this is really important because innovation is what advances society and improves people's lives. Also, I think I explained why you are just less interested in improving your existing technology when your profits are just capped as well. Let's talk about monopolies then. Isobel notes how all good technology right now was just some nerd in a garage's brainchild only a few years ago. The capacity to overtake monopolies is just so high in tech and is higher on our side. Because of things like the switching costs for users is pretty easy, there's more and more data transfer options, it's often low cost, but there's actually so much of this change is just attributed to you having unique innovation and user experience. For example, Zoom surpasses Skype, but also Microsoft Teams, Google Meets, and FaceTime get so much market capital because they have unique and exclusive features from Zoom. Like notably, Zoom is not 70% of the market share, they're only like 50% of the market share. And the reason for that is because Microsoft and Google Meets and things like that are able to code in unique features that Zoom cannot just take from them, which draws certain amounts of users to them and allows them to survive. Google is able to surpass Microsoft Edge. Like, I don't know, she gives you plenty of really awesome examples. People just do respond to innovation very well. At the point at which you make this innovation just able to be stolen by larger corporations or stolen by each other, you know, you don't have this capacity for innovation, but you also kneecap smaller corporations from ever being able to gain a dominant market share and surpass these monopolies. But I also do think that people respond to new things in tech quite easily because they are just exciting and cool. There isn't that much brand loyalty on tech. I think on their side, in fact, there are more pernicious instances of brands caring more about brand loyalty than actual innovation. Or for example, people distrusting new and smaller stuff because piracy happens so much. I think that people are less interested in innovation in this sense. But really importantly, and I think they just can't respond to this is just used in an incredibly bad way. Often copies of the code proliferate on the internet and are impossible for governments to regulate. But we firstly prove unfair theft of smaller niche corporations by larger corporations. But I would explain that the internet just gets super fucking dystopian. Like everything on the internet becomes the same. You don't get any freedom of choice and consumption because the programs you can choose from have all stolen from each other and all look exactly the same. There is no incentive to code new stuff when other companies can just take your best features. It's bad for the environment, it's bad for user experience. Proud to oppose.
Thank you everyone for that fine debate. We are now going to